Wild Mustang approaches elderly woman in a wheelchair, and what happened next amazed everyone. The morning sun painted long shadows across the Nevada desert as Margaret Wheeler guided her wheelchair onto her ranch house's wraparound porch. At 78, her movements were deliberate but determined, each push of the wheels a testament to the independence she'd fought to maintain since the stroke 3 years ago. The cool autumn air carried the scent of sage and morning dew, a familiar comfort that had drawn her to this remote piece of land near the Ruby Mountains 15 years earlier. Her arthritis-worn hands wrapped around a steaming mug of English breakfast tea, a daily ritual that connected her to memories of morning walks through Yorkshire's misty hills before she'd moved to America decades ago. The vast expanse before her was different from her homeland's gentle slopes, but it held its own wild beauty, one that had captured her heart when she'd first visited Nevada with her late husband, James. The distant thunder of hooves drew her attention to the horizon. Wild Mustangs occasionally passed through the public lands that bordered her modest ranch, but they rarely ventured this close. Margaret set down her tea and reached for the binoculars she kept nearby, her hands trembling slightly as she raised them to her eyes. Through the lenses, she could make out a small band of horses, their coats catching the early light. Among them, a striking black stallion moved with a grace that took her breath away. Even from this distance, she could see the proud arch of his neck, the powerful stride that spoke of both strength and elegance. Beautiful creatures, aren't they? The voice belonged to Tom Martinez, her twice-weekly caregiver and the son of her closest neighbor. He stepped onto the porch, carrying her morning medications and a cloth bag of groceries. "That black one," Margaret said, her British accent still crisp after all these years. "I've never seen him before." Tom set down the supplies and took the binoculars she offered. "That's Shadow. He showed up in these parts about 6 months ago. Been causing quite a stir among the BLM folks." "Shadow," Margaret repeated softly, watching as the stallion led his small band closer to the natural spring that lay about a quarter-mile from her house. "Why's he causing a stir?" Tom leaned against the porch railing, his weathered face creasing with concern. "He's smart, too smart, some say. Keeps leading horses away from scheduled roundups. They're worried about overgrazing, but can't seem to catch him." Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety at the mention of roundups. Though she understood the necessity of population management, the thought of these magnificent creatures being corralled and separated always troubled her. "He's just protecting his family," she said, more to herself than to Tom. Over the next few weeks, Shadow's band became regular visitors to the spring. Margaret found herself spending more time on the porch, watching their daily routines through her binoculars. She began to recognize individual horses, a dun mare with a distinctive white sock, a yearling colt whose playful antics made her laugh, and always Shadow, alert and protective. One particularly clear morning, as Margaret sipped her tea, something extraordinary happened. Shadow broke away from his band and began walking directly toward her house. Her heart quickened as the magnificent stallion drew closer, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light. "Oh my," she whispered, hardly daring to move. At about 50 yards from the porch, Shadow stopped. His ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he tested the air. Margaret held her breath, gripping the arms of her wheelchair. For several long moments, they regarded each other, the elderly woman and the wild stallion. Then, to Margaret's amazement, Shadow took several more steps forward. She could see now why he'd earned his name. His black coat had a subtle silvery sheen that shifted like shadows on water. "Hello, beautiful boy," Margaret said softly, her voice carrying on the still morning air. Shadow's ears flicked at the sound, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, dark eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that made her skin prickle. The moment was broken by the sound of Tom's truck coming up the drive. Shadow wheeled gracefully and cantered back to his band. But Margaret knew something profound had just occurred. That brief connection had awakened something in her she thought had been lost after her stroke, a sense of purpose. Over the next few months, Shadow's visits became more frequent. He would break away from his band each morning, approaching a little closer each time. Margaret began talking to him, sharing stories about her life in Yorkshire, her adventures with James, and her fears about growing old alone. Shadow would stand, head lowered, ears forward, as if absorbing every word. "You're making quite a name for yourself," Tom told her one morning as he helped her with her exercises. "People are talking about the wild Mustang that visits the English lady in the wheelchair." Margaret smiled, but there was worry behind it. "They're not going to try to catch him, are they?" Tom's hesitation told her everything. "There's a roundup scheduled for next month. Shadow's band is on the list. They're particularly interested in him, given how he's interfered with previous gatherings." The news hit Margaret like a physical blow. "But they can't. He's not causing any harm. He's just protecting his family." Her voice cracked on the last words. "I know, Margaret, but the BLM has their quotas. They're saying the land can't support the current population." That night, Margaret barely slept. She kept thinking about Shadow, about the trust they'd built, about the freedom that was such an essential part of who he was. The next morning, she did something she hadn't done in years. She started making phone calls. Her first call was to her solicitor in London, who helped her access funds from her family trust. The next was to a wild horse sanctuary in Montana she'd read about. Over the next few weeks, she worked tirelessly, leveraging every connection she had, drawing on resources she'd almost forgotten she possessed. The day before the scheduled roundup, Margaret sat on her porch, heart heavy with anticipation. Shadow approached as he had so many mornings before, but this time, he came all the way to the bottom of the porch steps. Margaret wheeled forward slowly, extending her hand. "I won't let them take you," she whispered. To her amazement, Shadow stretched out his neck and gently brushed his muzzle against her palm. The touch was electric, sending tears streaming down her face. The next morning, as BLM vehicles began assembling in the valley, Margaret was ready. Tom arrived early, along with representatives from the Wild Horse Sanctuary, her lawyer, and local media she'd invited. What followed was a carefully orchestrated presentation of her proposal. Margaret would fund the creation of a protected corridor on her land, connecting to the sanctuary's newly purchased adjacent property. Shadow's band would be allowed to range freely within this protected area, and Margaret's land would serve as a research station for studying wild horse behavior and sustainable land management practices. The BLM officials were skeptical at first, but the combination of positive press coverage, Margaret's impeccable preparation, and the sanctuary's reputation eventually won them over. By sunset, agreements were being signed, and Shadow's band was safe. As news of Margaret's successful intervention spread, something unexpected began to happen. People started visiting, wanting to learn about wild horses and Margaret's unique relationship with Shadow. She found herself sharing her knowledge, her story becoming an inspiration for others, fighting to protect wild horses across the American West. Local schools began organizing field trips to her ranch. Margaret would sit on her porch, Shadow often standing nearby, as she taught children about wild horses and the importance of preserving their freedom. She saw how the story of an elderly woman in a wheelchair forming a bond with a wild Mustang captured imaginations and opened hearts. The sanctuary established a small education center on her property, with Margaret serving as an advisor. Her medical conditions meant she couldn't be as physically involved as she might have liked, but her mind was sharp and her passion was infectious. Young volunteers would push her wheelchair along the specially constructed paths that allowed her to observe the horses, and she would share her insights about their behavior and social structures. Shadow remained free, as wild as ever, but his connection with Margaret deepened. He would still visit her porch most mornings, sometimes bringing members of his band with him. Researchers were amazed by this behavior, but Margaret understood it was simply trust, built on mutual respect and protection. One crisp autumn morning, almost exactly a year after Shadow's first approach, Margaret sat on her porch with her usual cup of tea. She watched as Shadow led his band to the spring, now expanded and protected as part of the sanctuary. The sight of the horses moving freely across the landscape, their future secured, filled her with a profound sense of peace. Tom, who had become more than just a caregiver but a true friend, joined her on the porch. "You know," he said, "when I first started working for you, I worried you were too isolated out here. I thought you needed to be closer to town, to people." Margaret smiled, watching as Shadow raised his head to look in their direction. "I've never felt less isolated," she said. "That horse, he reminded me that we're never too old, too disabled, or too different to make a difference. We just need to find our purpose." As if in response, Shadow let out a soft nicker, the sound carrying clearly across the morning air. Margaret raised her teacup in his direction, a gesture that had become their shared ritual. The sun caught the silver in his coat, making him shimmer like a creature from another world. Yet he was very much a part of this one, a symbol of freedom, of trust, and of the extraordinary bonds that can form between the most unlikely of friends. The story of Margaret and Shadow continued to inspire others. Conservation groups studied their model of protection and sanctuary, replicating it in other areas where wild horses face challenges. Margaret's ranch became a testament to what one person could achieve, regardless of age or physical limitations, when driven by compassion and determination. On warm evenings, Margaret would often sit on her porch until sunset, watching Shadow's band grazing peacefully in the distance. Sometimes, he would break away from the group and approach her, standing quietly nearby as the sky turned purple and gold. In these moments, Margaret felt a deep gratitude for the twist of fate that had brought this magnificent creature into her life. She thought often of James and how he would have loved this, the wild beauty of the horses, the purpose she'd found in protecting them, the way her life had opened up rather than diminishing with age and disability. Shadow had helped her discover that freedom came in many forms, and that the strongest bonds were those that allowed each being to remain true to their nature while supporting and protecting one another. As years passed, Margaret's ranch became known as a place where the impossible became possible, where the wild and the gentle could coexist, and where an elderly woman in a wheelchair and a wild Mustang had shown the world what it meant to be truly free. Their story became a reminder that sometimes the most profound connections come when we least expect them, and that age and physical limitations are no barrier to making a lasting difference in the world. Shadow remained wild, as he should be, but his choice to connect with Margaret transformed both their lives and created a legacy that would protect generations of wild horses to come. Their unlikely friendship proved that the most powerful bonds are those that respect and preserve the essential nature of each being while creating something entirely new and wonderful in the space between them. And so, on that remote ranch near the Ruby Mountains, where the sage grows wild and the morning air carries the scent of freedom, Margaret and Shadow's story continues to unfold. A testament to the enduring power of compassion, courage, and the unexpected connections that can change not just two lives, but countless others for generations to come.